They said the night Herod tightened his grip on Judea, even the stones of Jerusalem seemed to listen. Torches burned longer than usual, and shadows clung to the walls like secrets afraid to be spoken. Power had a sound in those days, the clink of armor, the murmur of fear, the sharp intake of breath when a door opened at the wrong hour. And within the palace, behind veils and guarded corridors, lived the Idumean royal daughters, women born into privilege yet trapped in a fate far darker than the common people could ever imagine. They were raised to believe that royal blood offered protection. From childhood, they were taught how to walk slowly so silk would fall correctly, how to speak softly but firmly, how to lower their eyes without appearing weak. Their tutors spoke of alliances and marriages as if they were sacred duties. Their nurses whispered stories of queens who survived by patience alone. No one prepared them for Herod's fear. Herod ruled not only with authority but with suspicion. He had climbed to power through favor and force, and he knew how easily both could vanish. He trusted no one completely, not his courtiers, not his generals, and certainly not his own family. The Idumean line, once a source of legitimacy, became in his mind a threat. Blood that connected him to the throne also reminded him how fragile that throne truly was. The daughters sensed the change before anyone spoke of it openly. Invitations stopped arriving. Friendly glances from officers turned cold. Servants lingered less, speaking in half-sentences, eyes darting toward doors. At night, footsteps echoed in the corridors long after lamps were dimmed. The women learned to recognize the sound of soldiers by the weight of their steps, the dull scrape of leather against stone. They were not prisoners, at least not at first. They could still walk in the inner gardens, still sit together and share memories of lighter days. But freedom narrowed quietly, like a noose pulled one careful inch at a time. Guards appeared where none had stood before. Letters went unanswered. Promised marriages dissolved into silence. Herod's soldiers were loyal not out of love, but fear. They had seen what happened to those who questioned orders. A man could be celebrated one day and executed the next, his name erased as if it had never existed. Obedience became instinct, a shield against the king's volatile moods. When orders came regarding the Idumean women, few dared to ask why. The daughters were summoned individually at first, always under the guise of routine matters. A question about lineage. A request to recall an old family alliance. Each meeting ended with polite dismissal and no explanation. But the eyes watching them grew sharper, more calculating. Information, they realized, was being extracted piece by piece, not from records, but from their reactions, their silences, their fear. What made their fate unbearable was not immediate cruelty, but the slow understanding that their lives no longer belonged to them. They were symbols now, symbols Herod wished to control, reshape, or erase. Rumors reached them through servants who dared to whisper. Names of executed relatives. Confiscated estates. A cousin who vanished after a private audience with the king. One by one, the daughters were confined to separate quarters. The explanation was protection, yet the locks were on the outside. Windows were narrowed. Their attendants were replaced by strangers loyal only to the palace guard. Isolation worked more effectively than chains. Deprived of one another's presence, their thoughts turned inward, looping endlessly around the same question, why? Herod's fear had grown into obsession. He imagined conspiracies where none existed. In his mind, every noble lineage hid a future rival. The Idumean daughters, by virtue of birth alone, represented a possibility he could not tolerate. He did not need proof. Suspicion was enough. The soldiers became instruments of that fear. They delivered messages without warmth, stood watch without expression, enforced restrictions with mechanical precision. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked too long, curiosity mixing with unease. None offered answers. Days blurred together. The women marked time by changes in light, by the sound of meals placed outside their doors. They replayed memories to stay anchored, laughter during festivals, the scent of incense in childhood rooms, the rare moments when Herod himself had seemed almost kind. Those memories felt dangerous now, like relics from another life. Then came the night when everything shifted. Orders were issued quietly, without ceremony. Soldiers moved with purpose, keys turning in locks that had not been opened for weeks. The daughters were escorted through unfamiliar corridors, deeper into the palace, away from light and air. No accusations were spoken. No trial announced. Silence itself became the sentence. They understood then that survival did not always mean living. Whatever awaited them was designed not merely to end lives, but to erase voices, to sever lineage, to ensure that no story could rise against the king's own version of history. Fear settled not as panic, but as a heavy certainty. As the doors closed behind them, the palace returned to its usual stillness. Torches flickered. Soldiers resumed their posts. And Herod, alone with his thoughts, convinced himself that he had acted for the good of his kingdom, unaware, or unwilling to admit, that in destroying those closest to him, he had revealed the deepest truth of his reign. Power sustained by fear ultimately consumes everything it touches. If death had come swiftly, it might have been merciful. Instead, the Idumean royal daughters were drawn into a quieter darkness, one that left no visible scars on the walls of the palace but echoed endlessly within them. They were kept alive, not out of kindness, but calculation. Living witnesses could be controlled. Dead ones could become martyrs. Their new quarters were stripped of identity. No personal belongings. No symbols of rank. Even their names were seldom used, replaced by titles or silence. In this place, individuality dissolved. Days were measured by compliance, by how well they learned to anticipate commands without being told. Herod never appeared. He did not need to. His will traveled through messengers and guards, through subtle changes in routine, through the knowledge that resistance would be met not with argument, but with consequences unseen and unspoken. The daughters realized that fear was more effective when it remained vague. Interrogations resumed, though the questions were rarely direct. They were asked to recall conversations from years past, to interpret the intentions of relatives long dead, to explain imagined loyalties. Any hesitation was noted. Any emotion recorded. Truth mattered less than consistency. Contradictions, even innocent ones, were treated as proof of deception. The soldiers carrying out these tasks were no longer faceless. Over time, patterns emerged. One guard avoided speaking entirely. Another softened his voice, as if that might ease his own conscience. A third seemed almost eager, mistaking authority for righteousness. They were men shaped by the same system that now crushed the women before them. What broke the daughters most deeply was not confinement, but humiliation disguised as necessity. Rituals once associated with honor were inverted. Privacy vanished. Dignity was rationed. Each small loss chipped away at the certainty of who they had been. Royal blood offered no shield here. In fact, it made the process more deliberate, more thorough. The outside world faded. News arrived distorted, filtered through rumor. Executions were mentioned casually, as if discussing weather. Alliances shifted. New names replaced old ones. The daughters understood that history was being rewritten in real time, and they were being written out of it. Yet even in this controlled silence, something stubborn remained. Memory. They clung to it fiercely. They remembered their mother's voices, the weight of ceremonial jewelry, the feeling of standing tall during public appearances. Remembering became an act of defiance, a way to assert that they had existed beyond these walls. Herod's aim was not simply punishment. It was erasure without spectacle. By keeping the daughters alive but invisible, he ensured that no public outrage would form, no songs of tragedy would spread. Suffering without witnesses leaves no legacy. That was the logic of his rule. Time changed them. Hair grew thinner. Movements slowed. Their reflections, when they caught glimpses of themselves in polished metal or water, felt unfamiliar. The women they once were seemed like distant relatives rather than former selves. This transformation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all, not the loss of life, but the slow fading of identity. Some soldiers noticed. They saw the way eyes dulled, the way posture collapsed inward. A few felt unease, but unease was easier to bear than disobedience. The machine of power did not require cruelty from every participant, only compliance from enough of them. In the end, the daughter's fate did not conclude with a single dramatic moment. It ended quietly, piece by piece, through isolation, neglect, and deliberate forgetting. When they were finally removed from the palace records, it was as if they had never been born. No public mourning. No acknowledgement. Just absence. Herod lived on, his reign remembered for grand buildings and ruthless decisions. Historians would debate his achievements, argue over his paranoia, analyze his political genius. Few would speak of the women whose lives were diminished in silence, because their story left no official trace. Yet history is not only what is written. It is also what is endured. The dark fate of the Idumean royal daughters serves as a reminder that some of the worst acts of power do not announce themselves with bloodshed or spectacle. They unfold in locked rooms, behind polite language and orderly procedures, where suffering is measured, controlled, and hidden. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, life continued. Markets opened. Children laughed. The sun rose and fell as it always had. The world moved forward, unaware that within stone corridors, royal bloodlines had been extinguished not by execution, but by a slow, deliberate unmaking, worse than death, because it denied even the dignity of an ending.